Hey everybody, welcome back to Tacks, our video series on moving ideas to action. I'm Nicole Chin, founder of Up With Community, a personal practice for connecting into our power for change. I am here today with Erik Peterson, activist, organizer, longtime campaigner, and principal of Bending the Arc Strategies. Erik, how are you doing today?
Great. Welcome to Minnesota.
Exactly. We're connecting NYC to Minnesota.
Yep.
So Erik, I wanted to talk to you today about narrative shift, what it is, why we do it, and how we can take steps towards it. And this is really coming out of, I got the wonderful opportunity to learn from you about narrative shift last year. There were a series of workshops that you led, and I just found it really gave me some incredibly helpful tools, not just to think about equity, but to think about all of the ways organizations need to see the world differently into building the world that their missions are calling them to build. Before we get into all of that, I just wanted to hear a little bit more about what you're up to in the world.
Well, thank you. It's great to be great to be talking to you. So what am I up to in the world? I work for my own consultancy, build my own consultancy, Bending the Arc Strategies, and in some ways, maybe that's the way into what I do. It's based, of course, on the Martin Luther King reconfiguration or paraphrase of the quote from Theodore Parker, and about the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I actually believe that's true, but I don't think that it's an accident of history. I think that we have to bend the arc. It's up to us to actually bend that arc towards justice, and in all the variety of ways I work with organizations and activists in order to how to build the campaigns, the power, the solidarity in order to bend that arc a little bit more towards justice. And one form or another of organizing for the last 35 plus years, that's a little painful to say.
Well, and I think that's a great segue into narrative shift. So what is narrative shift? How do you describe it to folks?
Well, so I start at the risk of like going 2 steps back. I actually start with what is narrative, because it's one of those buzzwords that's been thrown about a lot recently, and it means anything from a nice story to messaging to who knows what. It's a whole variety of things. It's not a right or wrong definition, but when I talk about narrative shift, I talk about it in terms of public narrative, and public narrative as something that is different from messaging. Like, do we have our talking points? Do we have our slogan, our top line messaging? There's a great way of thinking about it that I've sort of appropriated, taken from Ricardo Levins-Morales, and he's a social justice, Minneapolis-based social justice artist, and he talks about narrative as like the soil. And if you think about a farming metaphor and you think of our campaigns as the seeds, you can have the best seeds in the world, top line seeds in the world, and you throw them on hard packed clay soil or bad soil and they're not going to grow. And so in farming, the adage is you always pay attention to the health of the soil. You always focus on the soil, because if you have healthy soil, your seeds, many seeds will grow. And so if you think of narrative, the story, public narrative as our soil, it's our compost. It's what's the soil on which we're going to wage our campaigns? What's the environment in which we're going to weigh our campaigns? And at that point, we're talking now about worldview and the world of values, of stories, of beliefs. And when we talk about public narrative, it is what's the story that compellingly tells how we understand the world and frame the world between right and wrong through story. And so narrative shift is changing the story. And we've just simply got to change the story. And that's, for me, one of the most powerful ways in which we build power to win is to change the story.
Yeah, and the way I've heard you talk about this is the soil of narrative are, what are the stories that tell us about how the world works?
Yeah.
What our potential is as human beings, what's right and wrong, and what are the choices available to us, right? So let's talk about the dominant narrative today. How would you describe the dominant narrative today?
So I think that the dominant narrative, and again, there's different storylines to it, but I think if I were to sum it up, it's a market narrative. It's a narrative that believes that you make it or break it on your own. You're on your own. Good luck. Bootstrapped individualism, individual rights and responsibility. And in that world, competitive people competing back and forth produce the best products, the best outcomes within a free market economy, which can't be overregulated by government, because government is the antithesis. It's bureaucracy. It's all of that sort of stuff that stifles individual initiative and freedom and responsibility. And then that notion of racism and structure and sort of structural oppressions are historical. I mean, there are still bad racist people out there. The dominant narrative would say there's some rogue individuals out there. But boy, you know, we're past that racism thing. Obama was president. We're past that sexism thing. I mean, Oprah, for goodness sakes, is a multimillionaire. You know, it's like there's all of those notions that the structural impediments that we all know are still alive and well are just anomalies, and it's really based upon individualism. And then in the heart of, I think, the dominant narrative is an American exceptionalism, that America is the best. And by default, our position, whatever it is, and you see it playing out every day now in the Trump era, our position, regardless of what it is right, because we are America and we have a unique, separate destiny.
Yeah. And so, you know, when we as organizations sit in the soil of this bootstrap, go it alone, don't see structures and systems, you're doing okay, so the system must not be broken, right? And we've heard a lot of that around the Equal Rights Amendment. We've seen a lot of women say, you know, I'm a female business owner, so we don't need the Equal Rights Amendment anymore, right?
Yeah.
When we sit in that dominant narrative, it constrains what our organizations seek to build campaigns around.
Yeah.
It limits what we seek to win for policies.
Yeah.
Right? So we stop shooting for the thing we really want, and we start from a place of compromise because we've already accepted the bootstrap narrative. We've already accepted American exceptionalism.
Yeah.
Whereas if we shift our narrative to a different soil, we're going to dream bigger and more different, right?
I think it's about dreaming and thinking. Well, one is, I love your notion of constricted, that you know, the constriction of the dominant narrative, which funnels you into a certain way of thinking, a certain set of possibilities. And so I think it's about changing the narrative, is about thinking bigger and more expansively. But it literally shifts what seems to be a reasonable, normal, almost self-obvious outcome. I was just thinking, I was just reading an article, it was actually yesterday, I was going to say today, but it was actually yesterday, and it was around the whole issue of the racial equity gap in education. And the emphasis was upon, if you see, well, I'll just frame it differently. I'll frame it, if you see that gap, which is real, as from a dominant narrative, it's seen as in need of remediation because it's a lack of access to opportunities. It's a lack of access to material things. It's a lack of access to programs. It's a lack of access. And so therefore, that the way you shift it is you just need to provide the opportunities through remediation. And then individuals will be able to thrive and succeed. if you, and so you focus on remedial programs. If you see it as the almost inevitable expression of structural racism, suddenly the idea of remediating makes no sense. I mean, it's not that's the wrong way of saying it. It makes sense, but your attention suddenly turns that you have to actually go after the very structures of the educational system itself, the pedagogy, the curriculum. It wouldn't make sense to just put more resources into a system that is in fact the system that is causing the problem in the first place.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so then I often see, you know, when organizations haven't aligned on what is the soil we're planting our campaigns in, what do we believe to be true about how the world works, about how change happens, they get into fights about tactics, right? So like, yep. One organizer may want to do a program around remediation, around like access to services, and another organizer may want to do a campaign around systems change. And like you said, there's nothing inherently wrong or bad about addressing an immediate need, but it's how do these things come together? And instead of fighting about this tactical fight, how do we actually have a conversation about how the system works, right? So what are some steps organizations take when they first realize, okay, we need to get clear on narrative. What's the narrative we're owning? What are some of the first steps you encourage folks to take?
And I think we might get into this later because I think there's some pitfalls or some detours that you can try to avoid, which is one way of starting. And I think you already pointed to one of them, which I will just highlight, which is if you see narrative as just messaging, then it really is a tactical conversation. I mean, oftentimes your messaging, much of our messaging conversations, our messaging or our campaigns are tactics within a dominant narrative. How do we move this within a dominant narrative? If we're interested in systems change, then we're talking about how do we shift the soil? How do we create a different soil, create a different environment? And so, so that's one piece. And I think, so where I think it starts with is, one is understanding the difference. And then two, this is really, it's not therefore a communications issue. Narrative isn't a communications issue. It's really a transformational organizing activity, which starts with what are our fundamental beliefs, assumptions of the world. It starts with worldview. How do we see the world? And how is what we value in the world currently being thwarted, stifled, constricted? I loved your word, constricted. I just got this sense of withering, because it is a withering. How do our dreams, our needs get withered by the dominant? And that revelation starts you then into a conversation of, okay, there are actually different worldviews, different beliefs, assumptions, and those beliefs and assumptions and values shift and create different opportunities. And then we have a tendency, I think this is a warning more than anything else, I think we have a tendency, at least a lot of progressives I work with have a tendency to, because the power of the dominant narrative is so strong, I will doubt my own values and assumptions, because like that, people will think that's just naive. Love thy neighbor as thyself is just naive. That's just not the way the world works. That we do better together on so many things is just naive. That's not the way the world works. And so we truncate and actually self-edit ourselves, our own opportunities and possibilities. And so I think that where I start, I mean, that sounds like it's just literally a conversation a little bit about believe in, I mean, the values and the beliefs and the assumptions that structure your world are real, and they are actually shared. These stories compete, they're out there. We just don't very often speak to them.
Yeah. What you're pulling on for me is I see so many organizations say, we're going to do a 6-month process on our values.
Yeah.
And at the end of this, we're going to
You
have
got to throw in the mission.
values.
You got to throw in the mission and the vision and that in there too, please.
Exactly. So we put these things on paper, but we actually separate them from a description of how we think the world works, right? So we say the values live over here, but because we don't apply them to how the world works, the dominant narrative gets to keep functioning when we go to do our work in strategic planning.
Yeah.
And then we don't ask ourselves, do we believe these values? And what would our work look like, sound like, and feel like if we believed the values we had? And I got this feeling about 7 years ago when I started Up With Community, because I started doing a bunch of one-on-ones with folks that I truly respect. And I started talking to them about liberatory consciousness and liberation and freedom. And there would always be this kind of cynicism that sunk into our conversations that was like, oh, young, naive Nico, right?
Yeah.
Like, and I kind of set that aside and I was like, okay, let me see if there's other words I can use. Let me see if there's a different way I can be in the world. And then as I tried that out, realized it didn't work, I realized something. That in most of my organizational development projects that seem like they're about strategic planning or seem that it's about like some equity processes or proposals, at the heart of it is this question of, do you want to be free?
Yeah.
And underneath the question of, do you want to be free, is, do you believe you could be free?
Yeah, that's good. I like that. I like that.
And that for me is at the heart. Yeah. Go on. Yeah.
I really like that. Do you want to be free? And then, do you believe you can be free? And that's that sort of that short circuiting, that sort of self-censorship or self-curtailing that I see. And part of it is because we have become, I think, it's so easy to become so accustomed to the way things are. And that's the way a dominant narrative works. A dominant narrative takes a certain worldview and just makes it feel like it's the way the world is. It's just normal. That's just human nature. Human nature is just, we are competitive creatures. We're individualistic creatures. We are selfish creatures. That's just human nature. And so a market sorting that all makes total sense, except, science and a bunch of other things say, our competitive advantage as human beings is that we learned how to work together. So what's once you put these, I love you're talking about the values, that statement that organizations work on, because, okay, those are great values. Oh my God, justice and solidarity and equity. But what does that actually look like in terms of the way we behave as an organization? What we fight for as an organization, how we talk as an organization, and that to me, I love your phrase, free, do you really want to be free? Do you really want to go where those values take you?
And I think the invitation that I've seen in your narrative shift work is like, we can invite ourselves to live in our worldview and our values and our narrative. Yeah. And then it is not our work to convince people that this is the way they should be, but that it is to just invite them that this exists. And so you've always made a big point that we're not trying to convince people. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's great. Boy, this is really satisfying, Nico, because I get to hear some words that I know I've said in front of you coming back to you, which just makes my heart sing. But I talk about it as being an invitation, not an argument. And if you think of narrative and story, if you think of narrative as messaging, then we are trying to persuade somebody or, you know, argue with somebody to convince them of our point of view. And but think about it, if you think about it in terms of worldview, how do you argue somebody out of their worldview? How do you convince them that their fundamental core values of the world is just wrong? That really the sun rises in the west and sets in the east? You can't convince people of that. So what I love about narrative and thinking about story is people have complex and competing experiences. And any narrative works by selecting certain things to focus and emphasize and excluding others. And I think that's just the nature of stories. It's about selection. So the question is like, if you tell a story that suddenly makes a lot of sense, that explains what you are in fact feeling, but haven't actually even had a language perhaps to articulate. One, that's freeing and liberating in a powerful way, but suddenly that's the way you shift the story. That suddenly makes sense. You know, it suddenly
And what I
sense.
love about, what I love about that approach is there's just a deep respect for the other person. That's your baseline starting point. And why I think that is so important, because so much of the dominant narrative is to disrespect the other person, to treat the other person like an empty vessel that you can manipulate. Like, that is branding, that is marketing. You know, we've all been talking about Colin Kaepernick can't get a job at the NFL, but then they've got this social justice commercial. That's the dominant narrative, right? Is they're treating us like fools, right? And so then when we go to messaging instead of worldview, when we go to messaging before aligning on worldview, we're just doing that same dominant narrative of I can trick them into not voting against their best interest, right? And the condescension in that is so disrespectful to you and the other person. And so when we work from invitation and we work from respect, we're already building the fresh, clean soil.
Yeah.
But it's so hard to trust that process.
Oh my God, is it hard to trust the process? And it takes us, when I talk about it as being an organizing space more than a communication space, a woman that I learned a ton with, Phyllis Watts, and she's, I think, a psychologist who's gotten into messaging. She did some of the early work around the fetal personhood work down in the South. And I remember her talking to me about, I think it was in Louisiana or Alabama or Mississippi, I forget which one of those, but it was telling the story about, in a focus group, how this very religious woman who was very, very, very anti-abortion, very, very pro-life, said, I just think this personhood thing goes too far. I just think it goes too far. But then I just can't get out of my head what I am going to say to all those babies when I go to heaven. And I just thought, wow, what a conflict. And where do we give anybody the space to sort out those conflicts? And so that was and that notion that, for me, part of the transformational part of narrative work and narrative shift work is giving the space for people to sort out all of these really complex, conflicting stories and conflicting feelings within themselves. And so this notion that somehow you create your narrative, and that I can give you the narrative now, and you can deliver that narrative, and presto magico, something happens. This is really the deep process of sorting out conflicting values. Like, go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I think what you're getting at is narrative shift happens best within a container of relationship.
Absolutely, yeah. And
because
so,
you can't sort out that complexity,
Yeah, it's something I haven't really thought about. You're asking me good questions because I haven't really thought about the process of how you would approach that to people before. But that's probably what I should think about. But that notion of it is about built on relationship. But I think one of the processes of thinking as you're thinking about how do you do this is how do you build the container, the space, where you can have that conversation and where you can start building that relationship. And where you literally have the time and space to articulate and sort out conflicting things.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there any stories of campaigns that you've seen do narrative shift really well that you think illustrate this?
Yeah. I mean, some of them are happening right now, so we don't know.
So maybe some in the past, yeah.
Sure. But some in the past, I think one of the classic ones. One of the classic ones is the marriage campaign, where forever, and certainly when I first was involved, it was the whole story was around civil rights. This is a right. It's a right. And when you think of that, and this is again the connection, but their messaging and words do matter, and so that they do conjure up frames, they do conjure up stories, they do conjure up, sort of the whole worldview that we're talking about. But if you think about the whole fight for equality and the whole fight for human decency, that if that's seen as a legalistic, as a sort of fight over rights, you're in a legal framework and you're a legal thing. So in a dominant narrative, that's a zero-sum game. And the zero-sum game is that why should you get special rights as opposed to somebody else? And you get that language, or that right is going to take away somebody else's right, because in a zero-sum world, that's what happens. So within that frame, you're always fighting uphill. And what gets erased out of that is human beings. And so when the narrative really shifted and it focused on love, and the love that is expressed between two people. And what we're trying to do is make it possible and certainly not get in the way of two people who love one another, or deny people who love one another the ability to love in ways that I feel like I love. Suddenly, like, there's a whole bunch of things that just feel really, really wrong to do to people if you start seeing them as people. I mean, if you start seeing humans as human, because the same thing in the immigrant rights fight is you see similar sort of parallels. The minute you stop seeing people as objects or as invaders or as armies or as whatever, and start seeing folks as people, you cannot put people in cages.
And that's where the dominant narrative comes into some of our fights, when we treat people like widgets, when we treat people like robots or like things that can be traded or controlled. We're unintentionally recreating the dominant narrative that dehumanizes us, right?
Yeah. Or you get economic actors. I mean, this is the one that comes up all the time, and I think the left, the progressives are as guilty as anybody of the flip side of the dominant narrative. Is if we see people principally in terms of their economic contribution. So when I hear the communications around dreamers, for instance, or immigrants, and their economic value and how much more taxes they pay than they take, and how productive they are for our economy, and how all of this sort of stuff, as if a human worth is determined by their economic contribution, as opposed to you can't see a person as a human being and put him in a cage. You just can't do it. Or at least very, very few people can do it. And And
right.
that to me is the power of the narrative shift. If we start seeing refugees and as people who are fleeing and desperately trying to save their life and their family's life, as opposed to economic contributors, because then it's just a sort of a weighing the values of the economy, right?
I think one of the other components of the narrative shift we're talking about is how have you set up your organization, the social relationships of your organization, the timing and pacing of your organization to stay in your narrative rather than the dominant narrative.
Yeah, yeah.
Because we're constantly being barraged, right?
Yeah.
Like physically, emotionally, socially, to go back.
Yeah.
Go back to the dominant narrative, bootstrap, radical individualism, all of that stuff. And so I see organizations, even let's say they do the values. Let's say they believe in the values. Let's say they create a great campaign around the values. But then the pace of their work is super fast. Folks aren't sleeping well. Folks aren't eating well. Folks aren't seeing their family because they're at work all the time. They aren't seeing their friends because when they're not at work, they're trying to see their family, so they don't have time for their friends. And so the people that would help them hold on to the narrative they're trying to build in the campaign, they are completely isolated from.
Yeah.
They're completely isolated from their own health. And then we get shocked when we've lost the path.
Yeah. And then you rely
and so it's
on,
like, it's not just, yeah.
No, I was
Go
going
on.
to say, and then under stress, how do you react, right? When you're cut and you're out, if you have if we're offering a transformational narrative which talks about we all do better when we all do better, to quote Paul Wellstone, that we succeed better together. We are neighbors, and with being a neighbor, you don't want to be a dick neighbor. There's a responsibility, right? Like if we have that world, but in our own lives, we are cut off and we are under stress and we are in this sort of world. It's perfectly understandable that you fall back on the very familiar things that are all around you. And so there's a piece of me that there's that internal transformation, but organizationally, I think it's so important to it's like learning new habits. At some point, it just literally becomes the water that we swim in. But if you're learning a new language or a new word or a new practice or procedure, it is awkwardly, horribly, and imperfectly self-conscious for way too long. Until suddenly one day you start dreaming in color or you start speaking without thinking through the translation. And I remember the first day in Australia after I've done all that work there, the first time that I didn't have to do the 1.8 times, 1.8 times Celsius plus 32 to find out what the degrees in Fahrenheit was. So I knew how hot 20 degrees was, but I just suddenly knew what 20 degrees was. Like that moment.
You know what it felt like.
Yeah, you just know what it feels like. You know it. You talk. You say, "Oh man, I think it's about 16 out here today," and it's like, yeah, it's Celsius now. We're talking. It's probably 16 out there too, but that's Fahrenheit. But it's it's that moment. But that takes a long time. And so in the meantime, it's like any other craft. It's like any other practice. You gotta practice it, and you gotta practice it. And you have to have the tools I put it right up on when I was doing campaigning and I still encourage people to do campaign. I put it right up on my bulletin board. So there isn't a day that goes by that I don't see the story I'm trying to tell.
And this is where narrative shift always leads me to land in compassion. Because I'll start at the top of a conversation with a group of people who are trying to make change in their community at the very beginning of it. And they're just so angry at the people who aren't in charge, but who seem to agree with the people in charge, with a thing they disagree with, right? Like they're just bad people for believing that. And I'm like, we can't identify the people with the dominant narrative system.
Mm-hmm.
They're two different things. Because what's going to happen to these people that don't believe what we believe in this moment in time if we win? Do they all just disappear? Do we kill them? Do we ship them off to another country? Like, there has to be an on-ramp through compassion for those people to something outside of the dominant narrative. That on-ramp doesn't exist if from day one we can't hold. There's a dominant narrative, there's a system, there's a decision maker, and then there's the people. And there has to be daylight in between all of those things.
Yeah.
Right?
Boy, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
I like the notion of on-ramp. I love that notion of compassion and the notion that people, the word I keep on coming back to, and although I'm not terribly practicing religious, I grew up, my dad was a preacher, so I just hold on to that word, grace. I just think that so much of narrative shift and transformation, a transformational thing is way beyond just narrative at this point, but it just so depends upon grace and the understanding that we hold conflicting, contradictory, complex, we're complex people. We are, the people we are fighting are, and that's why I go back to that invitation, not an argument. You can't outshout somebody into a better world. You can't create a better way of life by outshouting somebody. You can win a fight, you can win a campaign, you can win a policy. You can't win a better way of life.
I think that's a good place to close it. I'm like, mic drop on that. Erik, this is wonderful. This has been a pleasure.
It has been,
really
actually. This is fun. I was scared shitless.
So people can find you at Bending the Arc Strategies, and they can check out more of these videos on our YouTube channel for Brass Tacks at YouTube or on our website, upwithcommunity.org.
Great.
Thanks,
you.
Erik.
Cheers.